The valley was quiet, green, and deceptively ordinary. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a wide basin tucked between gentle hills, its grass swaying in the breeze and a thin river winding along its edge. To the casual eye, it was a beautiful but empty piece of land, seemingly forgotten, waiting for development. But it was not forgotten. It belonged to someone who knew its history, who knew its boundaries, and who knew its value. The land had been in one family's possession for generations. Old records in the county courthouse carried its description, hundreds of acres defined by stone markers and water lines, with a reservoir hidden in the hills above. The family had never sold it, never abandoned it, and never surrendered their rights to it. But in a world where homeowners associations saw themselves as powerful, the truth often became an inconvenient detail. The HOA board that presided over a nearby neighborhood had grown restless. Their community was aging. The homes they managed were losing their shine, and property values weren't rising the way they wanted. Families who once clamored to buy their houses were now looking elsewhere, toward newer developments with modern amenities. The board needed a plan to keep their influence and their money flowing. And so they set their sights on expansion. They scouted for land, pitched grand ideas to investors, and painted pictures of a sparkling new neighborhood. 35 brand-new homes, sidewalks winding through manicured lawns, a playground for children, and glossy marketing brochures that promised a lifestyle of elegance. The board believed they were visionaries, that they were taking the future into their own hands, and when they found the valley, they convinced themselves they had struck gold. At first, there were murmurs of hesitation. Some remembered hearing that the land belonged to a family, though none could find it listed for sale. But hesitation was quickly drowned out by ambition. The board told themselves it must be abandoned. They whispered that no one cared for it anymore. They declared it unused, and with that, they gave themselves permission to move forward. Soon, surveying flags appeared in the soil. Heavy machinery rumbled down the hillsides. Trees were cut, the earth was flattened, and bulldozers carved roads through grass that had lain untouched for decades. Foundations were poured, concrete hardened, and before long, the first model home rose from the valley floor, bright and polished, a symbol of progress. The HOA congratulated itself at every step. They toured the half-finished homes with smug smiles, boasting about how quickly the lots had sold. They celebrated their vision with catered luncheons and glossy newsletters sent to residents in their original neighborhood. To them, the valley was theirs now, and the 35 homes would prove their dominance. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't even begin to imagine, was that every single wall they erected, every roof they placed, was built on a lie. The rightful owner of the land watched in silence. He had the documents, the proof, the lineage of ownership written in official ink. He could have gone to the county, filed a complaint, started the slow grind of legal warfare. But he knew better. HOAs had lawyers, they had money, and they thrived on dragging opponents into endless paperwork and bureaucracy. If he challenged them directly, they would stall, dismiss, and bury him in technicalities. And by the time any court agreed with him, 35 families would be living in houses on his land, and undoing it would be nearly impossible. So he did not fight them in court. He waited. He watched. And he remembered something the HOA had never bothered to learn. High in the hills above the valley, hidden by trees and brush, lay an old dam. It was not a massive concrete wall like the ones that made headlines, but a sturdy earthen barrier built decades ago to redirect water into a reservoir. The river that meandered past the valley drew its life from this reservoir, and behind the dam the water had been rising for years. It was contained, stable, and forgotten, until now. The owner knew the land better than anyone. He knew that. The basin where the HOA had built their homes was a natural floodplain. He knew that if the dam were opened, the valley would fill as quickly as a sink with the tap turned on. The houses, the sidewalks, the driveways, all of it sat in the bowl of the land, waiting for the inevitable. And the only thing keeping the water in place was him. As construction continued, his patience grew thinner. The HOA boasted louder and louder. They praised themselves for creating a community for the future, never once acknowledging that the ground beneath their feet didn't belong to them. The owner collected evidence. He photographed the dam, documented the reservoir, kept maps and deeds safe in multiple places. He was building a case, but not the kind the HOA expected. He waited until every last home was finished, until every family had moved in, until the HOA's pride was at its highest peak. And then, as rain clouds gathered over the hills, he began to prepare. The board had stolen his land. They had ignored the truth. And soon they would learn what it meant to build on foundations that were never theirs to claim. The water was waiting. The valley was ready. And the dam, old but powerful, stood like a weapon in his hands. The storm was coming. The first drops of rain tapped against the rooftops of the 35 homes like a warning no one heeded. Families inside closed their windows, adjusted their thermostats, and continued unpacking boxes. Children laughed as they raced up and down the freshly paved sidewalks, their voices carrying across the valley. To them, it was just another rainy day in their new neighborhood. But above them, high, in the hills, the storm was feeding the reservoir. The dam, which had quietly held back decades of accumulated water, began to swell under the pressure of runoff. The owner of the land stood in the shadows of the trees, rain dripping from his coat, watching as nature gave him the final push he needed. The water level rose, creeping higher, lapping against the earthen barrier. It was time. The HOA board, meanwhile, remained smugly blind. In their gleaming clubhouse, built hastily at the edge of the development, they toasted their success. The houses had all sold. The investors were pleased. They had done the impossible, they told themselves, taking worthless land and transforming it into a thriving community. They spoke of expansion, of more projects, of becoming a model for HOAs across the state. Not one of them considered where the land had truly come from or what forces it was never meant to withstand. The storm intensified. Sheets of rain lashed against the hillsides, funneling streams into the reservoir at a furious pace. Thunder cracked overhead, echoing through the valley. And then, under the cover of darkness, the owner of the land approached the dam. The structure was old but well-maintained. His family had checked it for decades, ensuring it never failed unexpectedly. Tonight, however, it would not fail. It would be opened. He knew the mechanisms. He knew how to loosen the sluice gate, how to let the water escape not in a trickle but in a rush. His hands, steady despite the storm, worked with purpose. The metal groaned, the gate shifted, and with a roar like an animal awakening, the water began to surge. At first, it was just a stream, tumbling down the rocky channel toward the valley below. But within minutes, the flow thickened, building into a wall of water that tore through brush and soil, following the natural path carved centuries ago. Gravity did the rest. The river that wound peacefully along the valley edge swelled in an instant. It overflowed its banks, spreading across lawns, driveways, and sidewalks. At first, residents thought it was simply a flash flood from the storm. Water seeped into garages, pooled around mailboxes, and rushed through storm drains that clogged, almost immediately. But as the minutes passed, the water didn't stop rising. It kept coming. Families scrambled to lift belongings off the floor. Cars were hastily backed out of driveways, engines sputtering in the rising current. Children, once gleeful in their games, were pulled inside as panic set in. The HOA board received frantic calls, their phones buzzing endlessly with demands for answers. But they had no answers. Their dream neighborhood was sinking before their eyes. Within an hour, the valley transformed. Streets vanished beneath a churning sheet of water. Decorative lawns became lakes, foundations so proudly poured by developers began to tremble as the ground underneath softened and shifted. One by one, basements filled, walls cracked, and furniture floated. The 35 homes, brand new and glistening just days before, now stood as fragile islands in a man-made flood. From the ridge above, the landowner watched. He did not cheer. He did not laugh. He simply observed, as justice unfolded in the most natural way possible. They had stolen his land, disregarded his rights, and ignored the truth. Now the land was reclaiming itself. Down below, chaos spread. Families tried to evacuate, their cars lined up in desperate convoys, headlights flickering in the storm. Some stalled in the deepening waters, forcing residents to wade to safety. Emergency services arrived, but even they struggled against the flood. The valley was not built for this. No drainage system, no emergency plan, no infrastructure could withstand the sheer volume of water unleashed from the dam. The HOA board, drenched and frantic, gathered at their clubhouse, shouting at one another over who was to blame. Some insisted it was a freak act of nature. Others whispered with dawning horror that the land had never been theirs to claim. A few remembered old rumors of a reservoir in the hills, a dam no one had ever bothered to locate. And now, it was too late. By midnight, the development was unrecognizable. Roof lines barely rose above the water. Cars floated aimlessly, colliding, with fences and lampposts. Furniture and toys bobbed in the current. The 35 homes, their paint still fresh, were ruined beyond repair. The board, once so proud of their achievement, could only watch as everything they had built dissolved into mud and wreckage. The owner of the land turned away from the scene. He did not linger. He had seen enough. He left the water to do its work, knowing that by morning the valley would be transformed into a cautionary tale. The HOA had thought they were untouchable, that rules and paperwork and arrogance could protect them. But they had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered: the land itself. As he walked back into the forest, the storm began to ease. The rain slowed, thunder rolled away into the distance, and the reservoir above the dam settled once more. The flood had done what it was meant to do. The valley, now drowned, would never be theirs again. Dawn broke over the valley, but the light did not bring comfort. Where a neighborhood once stood proud and orderly, there was now only devastation. The floodwaters had carved deep channels into the soil, leaving behind pools of stagnant water and wreckage scattered across the drowned streets. Roofs sagged, walls collapsed, and belongings lay ruined beneath layers of mud. The 35 homes, each a promise of new beginnings, had become lifeless shells overnight. Residents stood in shock along the higher ground where they had fled during the storm. Some clutched their children, others stared silently at the destruction, and many wept openly as they realized their investments, their savings, and their dreams had been washed away. They had trusted the HOA, trusted the board, trusted that their money had been spent wisely and their homes were secure. But now, in the cold light of morning, that trust was gone. Emergency crews waded through the water, marking houses that were unsafe, helping families salvage what little they could. Trucks arrived with sandbags and pumps, but it was a futile effort. The flood was not a passing storm. It was the valley returning to what it had always been, a floodplain fed by the reservoir above. The homes had never belonged there. The HOA board convened in what remained of the clubhouse. Its floors were soaked, the polished wood warped beyond repair, but the board members sat around a warped table, faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They argued in hushed but frantic tones, trying to piece together explanations. Was it negligence, an act of God, or something more deliberate? Some suggested filing insurance claims, others feared lawsuits from every direction. One board member, pale and trembling, whispered that the land had never been legally secured, that deeds and titles had been forged in the rush to profit. His words silenced the room. News crews soon arrived, their cameras capturing the ruin. Reporters spoke of a disaster, of families displaced, of questionable development practices. Drone footage showed the once pristine neighborhood now resembling a ghost town, submerged in water. Questions spread quickly. Who approved this project? Why were homes built in such a vulnerable valley? And who truly owned the land beneath it? All? The answers pointed in one direction. The HOA, once so powerful and arrogant, was now exposed. Investigators uncovered hastily signed contracts, ignored surveys, and warnings that had been buried under promises of profit. Neighbors beyond the valley recalled the true landowner, a man whose family had held the property for generations. He had refused to sell, they said. He had been ignored, dismissed, trampled by the HOA's greed. Now his absence during the catastrophe spoke louder than words. The residents, desperate for someone to blame, turned on the board. Shouts echoed through the broken streets as families demanded refunds, demanded accountability, demanded to know why their lives had been destroyed. The board, once the enforcers of petty rules and fines, now faced the wrath of those they had lorded over. Lawsuits piled up, personal fortunes evaporated. The proud HOA that had promised paradise now crumbled under the weight of its lies, and above it all, the landowner remained silent. He did not need to speak. The valley itself told the story. He had not destroyed the homes, the flood had. He had simply reminded the land to be what it had always been. The HOA had chosen arrogance over respect, greed over caution, and now they had paid the price. Weeks turned into months. The valley was declared uninhabitable. Insurance companies refused to cover the losses, citing negligence. Mold crept into the ruined houses, and scavengers stripped away anything of value. The once proud development became a wasteland, its signs of luxury fading into decay. Families moved away, scattered to other towns, leaving behind only the husks of their dreams. The board members faced lawsuits, criminal charges, and financial ruin. One by one, they abandoned the valley as well, their empire destroyed not just by water, but by the truth. The story spread far beyond the region, a cautionary tale told in news articles, documentaries, and whispered warnings to other ambitious developers. Don't build where the land doesn't want you, people said, and never cross the rightful owner. Nature reclaimed what was hers. Grass sprouted through cracked pavement, fish swam in what used to be basements, and birds nested in rooftops that no one would ever repair. The valley slowly returned to a wetland, a sanctuary for life rather than a prison of concrete and fences. The dam above remained, but its gates stayed closed, watched carefully by the man who had opened them once before. He knew he would never need to do it again. The valley had spoken, and its message would not be forgotten. In the end, there were no heroes, only lessons. The HOA learned that power and arrogance could not stand against truth. The residents learned that blind trust could be costly. And the landowner, who had stood silently as justice unfolded, learned that sometimes revenge required no fire, no violence, no spectacle, only patience, and the quiet force of nature itself. The development disappeared from maps. The HOA dissolved, its name a stain on legal records. But the story lived on, told with a mix of disbelief and awe. How 35 homes were built on stolen land, and how a single man opened a dam and watched as the valley reclaimed its own. And so the water remained, still and unbothered, covering the ruins beneath. A reminder to all who passed that greed had consequences, and that no wall of concrete or paper could ever hold back the tide of justice forever.